History is often told through kings, wars, and dates, but most lives passed without names being remembered. At the Historic Tales, we listen to ordinary people and the small decisions that shaped their days. Welcome to the Historic Tales.
I was born into a world that spoke but did not explain itself. Before I knew my own name, I knew the sound of boots pressing into wet mud, heavy and steady, marking the rhythm of mornings before the sun had fully risen. Before I knew numbers, I knew the weight of a bucket filled too high, water trembling at the edge, spilling over my hands as I tried to carry it without falling. And before I understood that words could be written down and kept, my life had already been decided without them.
I was born around the year 1800 in a farming village in northern England. I say around because no one marked the day. No paper recorded my arrival. There was no ink, no church record, no written proof that I had begun. My mother remembered it by the weather. She said the wind was soft, not cold, not sharp. The soil smelled new, freshly opened by the first work of spring. That was how she knew. And for us, that was enough.
In our home, memory replaced writing. Faces replaced signatures. Promises were spoken once and expected to last forever. A man's word carried weight, and once given, it was rarely repeated. There were no documents to settle disagreements, no pages to confirm truth, only voices, only trust, only the quiet understanding built over years of shared living. I grew up surrounded by sounds rather than symbols. The creak of wooden doors before dawn, the crackle of fire being coaxed back to life, the distant lowing of cattle waiting to be fed. These were the first lessons I understood. They told me when to rise, when to move, when to prepare for the day ahead. My mother spoke little, but her presence filled the house. She measured time by seasons, not by numbers. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant gathering, winter meant endurance. There were no calendars on our walls, yet life moved with perfect order. As a child, I did not question this way of living. I did not know another existed. The world felt complete, shaped by hands and weather rather than ink and paper. What was spoken mattered. What was remembered endured. Sometimes I watched travelers pass through the village carrying folded papers and sealed envelopes. They handled them carefully, as if they contained something fragile yet powerful. I did not know then that such papers could decide land, work, and future. To me, they were only objects, silent, mysterious, distant from my life.
Days passed in simple rhythm. I followed my mother across the yard, learning by watching rather than asking. I learned the feel of soil between fingers, the balance of weight on tired arms, the patience required to wait for seasons to change. These were my first lessons, and they shaped me more deeply than any written word ever could. I did not know then that this way of living would fade. I did not know that the world would soon fill with signs, records, and rules written where I could not reach them. I only knew this life, measured in weather, memory, and work, was mine.
My earliest memory is not a voice, it is a feeling. Cold stone beneath my bare feet, even in summer, the kind of cold that travels upward, settling into the bones before the day has properly begun. I remember standing still,
unsure where to place myself, learning very early that space mattered. I was small, thin, and often in the way. Adults moved around me like weather, unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp. When they spoke, I listened carefully, not to understand every word, but to learn when to step back, when to stay still, and when to move without being asked. Listening was a kind of safety.
By the time I was 7, I worked. Not because anyone dragged me into it, and not because I was punished if I refused. I worked because everyone did. Work was how you proved you belonged. It was how you showed you were useful, and being useful meant being allowed to stay. I carried water from the stream in buckets that were always filled a little too high. My arms shook, and water spilled over the rim, soaking my clothes before the sun had warmed the air. I chased sheep from fields they did not belong in, learning their moods, their sudden turns, their stubborn pauses. I held tools too large for my hands, handles worn smooth by men before me, and learned how to balance their weight so they did not pull me forward into the dirt.
Pain arrived early. It was never dramatic. A scraped knee, a blister that broke and hardened again, a muscle that ached deep inside the shoulder. Pain never stayed long, but it always returned, like a familiar visitor that did not need an invitation.
Across the lane stood a small stone building. I noticed it long before I understood its purpose. Once a day, children entered it holding slates and chalk. They walked differently from us, less hurried, more certain. When they emerged later, their fingers were white with dust, and they spoke of letters and sums as if they were common things. I watched from a distance. I told myself I was not curious, but that was not true. I was careful. The building felt like a place with rules I did not know. Its doorways seemed narrow, even from afar, as if it decided who was meant to pass through. No one told me I could not go inside. No one told me I could. So I stayed where I was. Each day I returned to my tasks. Each day the stone building filled and emptied without me. Life continued in a steady rhythm. Water carried, animals guided, tools lifted and set down again. I learned the language of effort, the meaning of fatigue, the comfort of routine. At the time, I did not feel left behind. I did not know there was something I was missing. I only knew this world of hands, soil, and movement. And within it, I learned how to stand, how to endure, and how to belong, without ever stepping across that stone threshold. My father believed in few words. He did not explain himself, and he did not need to. He taught by watching, by standing close enough for me to feel his presence without feeling his weight. When I did something wrong, he did not shout my name or strike the table in anger. He simply took the tool from my hands and showed me again, slowly, carefully, as if time itself had paused to make room for the lesson. Once, that was all you were given. After that, you were expected to remember. His hands were rough, shaped by years of work, but his movements were precise. He did not waste effort. Every motion had a purpose, and every mistake cost something. I learned early to watch not just what he did,
but how he did it, the angle of his wrist, the pressure of his grip, the patience in his pause before beginning again. Mistakes were expensive, not in anger, but in consequence. A broken handle meant no work that day. No work meant no coin, and no coin meant less food on the table when evening came. Hunger was never dramatic in our house. It did not arrive with shouting or tears. It was quiet. It waited. It made itself known in smaller portions, in thinner soups, in the way bread was cut carefully so that no crumb was wasted. I learned to notice these things without being told. Once, at night, my mother counted coins by the fire. She always waited until the house was still. The flames cracked softly, casting shadows that moved along the walls like slow breathing. She laid the coins out one by one, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. Each sound mattered. The dull tap of metal on wood carried weight. If a coin slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor, the room held its breath until it was found. In those moments, no one spoke. I watched from my place near the hearth, pretending not to watch at all. I learned the value of silence there and the meaning of patience. I learned that wealth was not counted by how much you had, but by how carefully you handled what little there was. My father would sometimes glance toward the coins, then back to the fire. He never interfered. He trusted my mother with the numbers he did not need to see. Trust, I learned, was another thing never written down. When the counting was done, the coins disappeared into a small cloth pouch and then into a place only my mother knew. Life continued as if nothing had happened, but something always changed after those nights. A purchase delayed, a journey postponed, a meal made simpler. That was how decisions were made, quietly, without announcement. I learned then that small things decide large futures. A single mistake, a single dropped coin, a single moment of carelessness. They did not seem important on their own, but together they shaped everything that followed. And long before I understood the world beyond our door, I understood this. Survival was built not on grand choices, but on careful ones, remembered well. My father's cough began in winter. At first, it sounded like nothing, just a dry sound in the cold air, easily ignored. Winter always brought coughs. No one paid them much attention. We were used to discomfort. We learned to carry on through it. By spring, the cough filled the house. It followed him from room to room, settling into the walls, lingering after he had moved on. It grew deeper, heavier, as if it came from somewhere far inside him. Still he worked. Men like him always did. Work was not something you stopped because your body asked you to. You stopped only when it no longer obeyed. I watched him closely then. I noticed how often he paused to catch his breath, how his shoulders lifted more than they used to, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. He never spoke of it. Speaking would have given the illness a shape, and once shaped, it could not be ignored. One morning, he sat instead of standing. It was a small thing, a chair pulled closer to the fire, a longer pause before lifting his boots, but I felt it immediately. Something inside me tightened. That was when I knew. The world did not end that morning. The light came through the window as it always had, but it shifted just enough for me to see it differently. His strength faded quietly. There were no dramatic moments, no final instructions. He grew thinner, his breath grew shorter, and then one day it stopped. He died without words,
When he stopped breathing, the room felt wrong, as if something essential had been removed, not added. The silence was heavier than any sound he had made. I stood there unsure what to do with my hands, with my body, with myself. My mother did not cry out. She sat very still, as though movement might break what little balance remained. No priest wrote his name. No notice marked his passing. There was no paper to say he had lived, no ink to say he was gone. Only memory, already beginning to fade at the edges. Men from the village came and went. They spoke in low voices. They offered help that lasted only as long as their words. When they left, the house felt larger, emptier, colder. That evening, my mother placed his tools against the wall. She did not ask me to take them. She did not have to. I became the man of the house without ceremony. There was no moment where someone told me so, no hand on my shoulder, no acknowledgement. The change happened in expectation. I rose earlier. I spoke less. I carried more. Childhood did not end suddenly. It thinned, like fabric worn too often, until there was nothing left to hold on to.
I did not grieve the way people speak of grief. I worked. I endured. I filled the space he left with motion and effort. But at night, when the house settled into silence, I felt the shape of his absence pressing in on me. That was when I understood that loss does not announce itself. It simply stays.
Men spoke to me differently after that. Their voices grew shorter, sharper, as if time itself had become expensive. They no longer explained, they expected. I nodded more than I spoke. I learned quickly that understanding was less important than appearing steady. If you looked certain, others believed you were. If you hesitated, they noticed. At 12, I carried loads meant for adults. There was no discussion about it. The work simply arrived, and I met it where it stood. My shoulders changed shape under the weight. Muscles formed where there had once been softness. My back learned to bend in ways it never fully forgot. Childhood did not leave with a single moment. It slipped away quietly, without protest, replaced by routine and responsibility. I woke before dawn and returned after dark. Meals grew quicker. Words grew fewer. I measured days by what a body could endure rather than what a mind could learn. When exhaustion came, I accepted it without question. It was part of the work, and the work was part of survival. One afternoon, a man came to our door holding paper sealed with wax. The seal was red, cracked at the edges, as if it had already been handled too often. He did not remove his hat when he entered. He did not need to. His position did that for him. He read aloud. His voice was smooth and practiced, shaped by repetition. The words flowed together in a way that made them sound less like choices and more like facts. Rent would rise, payment would come sooner, conditions would change. There was no pause for response. I stood nearby, listening carefully. I did not understand the words themselves, but I understood what they did. I watched my mother's hands as she worked. They moved steadily at first, then stopped altogether. That was how I knew. Her fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed, as if letting something go.
The man finished reading and folded the paper with care, as though it mattered only while it was being spoken. He left without looking back. The house felt smaller after that. That night, my mother did not speak much. She waited until the fire burned low, until the room belonged only to us. Then she took the letter, studied its marks as if they might change, and folded it again. She did not burn it. She did not tear it apart. She placed it beneath a loose floorboard, pressing it down carefully, as though hiding it could soften its weight. The wood settled back into place. The letter disappeared. It did not change what had been said. But in that moment, I understood something important. Words written on paper had power, even when they were silent. They could travel without a voice. They could decide things without asking. I felt small then, smaller than I had felt since my father died, not because of the work or the hunger or the weight on my shoulders, but because the future was being shaped by marks I could not read. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I learned that day that silence was not always chosen. Sometimes it was assigned. And from that moment on, I carried the knowledge that my life could be changed by a page I was never meant to touch. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant not to read. Before that day, the world had felt heavy but simple. Work was work. Hunger was hunger. Loss was something you carried without naming. But standing there, watching a decision unfold in words I could not follow, I felt a new kind of distance open between myself and the world around me. My life was shaped by sounds I could not repeat and marks I could not recognize. Words passed over me like wind, audible, powerful, but impossible to hold. Decisions arrived fully formed, like weather. You did not argue with them, you prepared or you suffered. I told myself it did not matter. I had my body. My hands were strong. My back did not yet ache in the mornings. I could work longer than most men and complain less. That was worth something. That had to be enough. So I returned to my tasks and let the days fill themselves again. I carried stone. I dug earth. I followed instructions given quickly, without explanation. I learned to read faces instead of pages. A raised eyebrow meant caution. A tightened jaw meant hurry. A quiet voice meant trouble. In this way, I survived. In this way, I adapted. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But something settled inside me that day. Something heavy. It was not anger. It was not shame. It was an awareness that stayed with me even when I tried to ignore it. A knowledge that the world was moving forward on paths I could not follow, guided by signs I could not see. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. The fire crackled softly. The wind pressed against the walls. I thought about the letter beneath the floorboard, silent but powerful, deciding things without asking permission. I wondered how many other letters existed, how many rules, how many agreements, how many futures already written without me. I told myself again that it did not matter, but when men spoke of notices posted in town, I felt it. When they laughed about words misspelled or names written wrong, I felt it. When a child read aloud with pride, I felt it. Not as jealousy, but as separation. I began to understand that strength alone was not always protection,
that endurance did not grant you a voice. I could lift what others could not, but I could not lift myself into the world that paper controlled. Still, I did not try to change it. Change required time, and time was a luxury I did not have. Each day was already spent before it began. Each night ended in exhaustion. So I carried the weight quietly. I worked harder. I spoke less. I made myself reliable, because reliability was one thing no one questioned. If I could not read the future, I could at least be counted on to meet it.
And yet, beneath all that effort, the feeling remained, a quiet understanding that some doors had been closed before I knew they existed. I did not stand before them and knock. I simply learned how to live in the space I had been given. And that knowledge, unspoken, unshared, became one of the heaviest things I ever carried.
As I grew older, work pulled me farther from home. The village I had known became smaller behind me, a memory fading against the weight of new roads carved from earth. I followed those paths, carrying stone and mortar, helping lay the foundations of canals that would carry water and commerce far beyond anything I could imagine. Nights were spent among men who carried their past silently, each step and word measured, each glance a reminder of what they had survived. Some of the men could write. They signed papers with careful loops and flourishes, declaring their names as if that alone made them important. Others, like me, marked an X. It was the same mark I had made since I was a boy, a quiet declaration that I existed even if I could not inscribe it fully. Sometimes we laughed about it, sharing stories in the dark or while trudging home after a day heavier than any I had known. Laughter made it lighter. For a moment, the world felt less like a series of instructions I could not follow, and more like a place where I belonged.
Once, a man offered to teach me letters. It was rare for someone to take interest in a boy who labored with his hands rather than his mind. We traced shapes in the dirt during breaks. I followed his finger carefully. A, B, C. Each symbol felt fragile, temporary, as though it might vanish if I pressed too hard. My hands were used to weight, tools, stones, buckets of water, not these shapes that existed only to be remembered in memory. I tried. I wanted to hold them, to make sense of them. But after long days of lifting and carrying, my mind had no room left for symbols. My back ached, my arms trembled, and the letters seemed to float away as soon as I traced them. I stopped trying. It was not shame, it was practicality. My life had demanded strength, endurance, and focus long before I could hope to understand the quiet world of ink and paper. Letters could wait, I told myself, or maybe they could wait for someone else. And so I continued. I carried stone, dug earth, guided water through the channels men had planned centuries ahead of me. I learned to survive in a world that measured ability by what you could lift, what you could endure, and how steady your hands remained. I learned to read people instead of pages, expressions, gestures, sighs. They were far more immediate, far more powerful than ink on paper. Still, the memory of those fragile letters lingered in the corners of my mind, a reminder that there was a world I had touched but never fully held. A world that existed alongside my own, parallel, unreachable, and quietly shaping everything I could never write. When my mother died, I was away. The news did not arrive on paper. It came through another man's mouth, carried in a voice that tried to sound steady, but could not hide its weight. He spoke my name first, then paused, as if searching for gentler words that did not exist. I understood before he finished. Some messages do not need full sentences. I walked back as quickly as I could, though each mile felt longer than the last. The road seemed unfamiliar, even though I had walked it many times before. My thoughts were not loud. They moved slowly, heavily, like steps through deep mud. By the time I returned, her belongings were already divided.
The house felt smaller, emptier, as if it had forgotten how to breathe. Familiar objects stood in unfamiliar places. Voices murmured in low tones, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. Without her, the order she had quietly held together began to loosen. There was no will, no paper with her name, no written instruction to guide us, only memory, only argument. People remembered differently. Some spoke of promises, others spoke of fairness. Small things became important, too important. A cup, a blanket, a wooden box. Each object carried meaning, and meaning carried conflict. I did not argue. I watched. I listened. I let others take what they believed was theirs. When the room had emptied and the voices had faded, I found her shawl folded near the hearth. It was worn thin at the edges, softened by years of use. I lifted it carefully, almost afraid it might fall apart in my hands. It still smelled like smoke from the fire she had tended every evening, and beneath that, a faint warmth that felt like her presence lingering in the fabric. I kept the shawl. That night I sat alone in the quiet house. The fire burned low, casting slow shadows along the walls. Every sound felt distant. Even my own breathing seemed unfamiliar. I placed the shawl across my shoulders, and for a moment I felt less alone, not comforted, but steadied. And then a thought came, slow, clear, and impossible to ignore. If I disappeared, there would be nothing left that proved I had lived. No papers carried my name. No letters held my words. No record marked my birth, nor would one mark my end. My life existed only in memory, in the minds of those who knew me, and memories are fragile things. They fade, they change, they vanish. I did not feel fear. I felt understanding. I had spent my life building, lifting, enduring, leaving marks on wood, stone, and soil, but none of those marks carried my name. The world moved forward, and men like me moved with it, unseen, unrecorded, yet essential. I wrapped the shawl tighter around me and stared into the fading fire. Perhaps proof was not always written. Perhaps existence did not depend on ink or paper. Perhaps living, working, and being remembered, even briefly, was enough. Still, the thought stayed with me, not as sorrow, not as regret, but as a quiet truth I would carry for the rest of my days. I lived carefully. Every step, every word, every action was measured. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Life had taught me early that care could make the difference between survival and suffering, between being noticed and being forgotten. I carried my body through days of work, through years of labor, and through the quiet moments when the world felt heavier than it should. I learned to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked, to move in rhythm with the lives of those around me, and to place my hands where they were most useful, even when my heart wanted to do something else entirely. I helped others when I could. It was not always easy, and it was not always acknowledged. Some people barely noticed my presence. Others whispered gratitude that could not be recorded because there were no records of such small kindnesses. Yet each act mattered, if only to me. Each time I steadied a shoulder, carried a load, or guided a lost animal back to the field, I reminded myself that life could be lived quietly, without notice, and still leave a mark. I learned to listen deeply, not just to words, but to tone, to hesitation, to the smallest pauses. Where paper or ink might convey fact, tone revealed truth. A soft sigh, a quick glance, the tension in a voice. These became the measures by which I gauged the world. I learned that understanding people required patience and attention far more than learning letters or numbers. In listening, I found connection, safety, and sometimes something like love. I loved in small ways, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with attention and care. I remembered birthdays by the way the light fell through a window. I noticed a friend's tired hands and carried extra water. I held animals close when storms came. Love was quiet, folded into action, a steady pulse rather than a shout. I endured in quiet ones. Pain, loss, hunger, and loneliness came often, and they came without ceremony. I endured because I had to, because there was no one to carry the weight for me, and because endurance had become part of my body, part of my mind. It shaped the way I moved, the way I spoke, and the way I remembered those who had gone before me. I left no signature, no letter, no record. My life was not documented, and yet it existed fully. Only work, only memory, only the small, quiet acts that passed from one day to the next. And in those acts, the essence of me remained, though invisible to most of the world. And now, if you are hearing this, something of me remains. My hands, my voice, my silence. Some part of me has survived long enough to be noticed. For a man who lived without words, who carried a life without ink, without record, this is more than I ever expected. To exist in memory, to have lived in ways both seen and unseen, is enough. Perhaps it is all that a life truly needs. I lived, I endured, I remained, and in the quiet, that is my proof.
The life you heard today was not famous. Many lived in similar ways, under similar pressures, making careful choices with limited control. Thank you for listening. If you want more stories like this, like and subscribe.